today. A note from me to you, those in Team HTM who have not done community service, you know your service is on the 5th of November, correct? Look for emails from me. Those of you who have not done service as you described by me, raise your hand, and you're not in Team HTM. You will be getting a notice from me on Blackboard as to what you will be doing for the next couple of days, okay? It'll be something that's tied to our industry. So you're good to go there. That's all I have. Dr. Caselli?
Thank you, Dr. Lopa. One announcement. The final exam is online. Okay, so those of you that are making plans or looking for other ways to avoid having to take that exam during its prescribed time, keep that in mind. It's online. You don't have to ask me if you can readjust it because it's available to you anywhere. Now for the important part of the class today, our executive in the classroom, Stephen Frieden. He joins us uniquely as another professor. I think he is the first professor we've had in this series. He's an award-winning investigative journalist and essayist and an adjunct professor at Columbia University. His acclaimed first biography, Thing of Beauty, The Tragedy of Supermodel Gia, inspired the Emmy-winning film Gia and introduced the word fashionista into the English language. He's also the author of the widely praised books Appetite for America, How Visionary Businessman Fred Harvey Built a Railroad Hospitality Empire that Civilized the Wild West. This was selected by the Wall Street Journal as one of the top 10 books of the year. And that will be the focus of his talk today. He's a two-time winner of the National Magazine Award. He's written for Vanity Fair, GQ, the Washington Post magazine, Rolling Stone, Glamour, Ladies' Home Journal, Paradise, and Philadelphia Magazine. He lives in Philly. Mr. Fried, welcome.
Thank you. How do I attach this? It's
rope it through that little.
And then.
Yeah. Let me do that. Hold tight.
It's like having a bib put on.
You're on.
There you go. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm here to talk about somebody who you already should know everything about, and you don't, which is part of the problem. Fred Harvey invented the business you all want to go into, and until this biography of him that I wrote came out 2 years ago, I think very few people knew that. Dr. LaLopa and I have been emailing prolifically for the last year and a half about the idea of me coming in and talking about Fred Harvey here. He got involved, got interested in the book, and was incredulous, as many people in the industry who read the book are, that he never heard much about Fred Harvey before and didn't realize that a lot of the things you learn about that are things that people think were invented in the 40s and 50s and 60s in America actually go back to the 1880s and 1890s and were being done for years before all the people you've heard of really got into this business. So I'm going to introduce you to somebody who I think you really should know about and who I think does two things. One, lets you realize the business you want to go to has a much deeper history than you realized. And two, that the challenges of your business are no different today than they were in the 1880s, which I hope is somewhat comforting. It means that you can't solve any of these problems, but you're still trying to make them better at every point. This is Fred Harvey. I guess I should ask first, how many of you knew who Fred Harvey was before this showed up on your agenda? Wow, none. Let me ask you this. How many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, so if you've been to the Grand Canyon, in theory, you know who Fred Harvey is. The Grand Canyon is where I first met Fred Harvey. All the hotels along the rim of the Grand Canyon were originally created by the Santa Fe Railroad for the Fred Harvey Company to run as really the beginning of southwestern tourism at the turn of the century. And I met Fred Harvey the way millions of people do every year. This is the portrait of him that hangs in the main old hotel there, El Tovar, which people look at like I did in 1993 when I was first there and said, who the hell's that? And then you go to your room and you get a little pamphlet and it tells you a little more about Fred Harvey and you're still kind of wondering. And then if you have time, you go to the Painted Desert National Park, which isn't far away, and drive through there. And at the end there's a huge building which has a big red illuminated sign in script that says Fred Harvey, as if you're supposed to know what this name is and who the hell Fred Harvey is. I had that experience in 1993. and for years wondered about it. This is a picture of my wife, the author Diane Ayers, at our trip to the Grand Canyon in 1993. She is spinning on her fingers 6 guns that were purchased at the Fred Harvey gift shop. She wears holsters and a Marshall badge. And besides the fact that it's a cute picture of my wife, it really captures one of the things that I thought was really interesting in getting involved in the Fred Harvey story to begin with, which is we have this amazing fascination with the American West as Americans. We don't even know why. My wife grew up in Erie, outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, not a major cowboy capital. But still, the stories of cowboys and Indians, which were the first reasons that people got fascinated by the American West, are fascinating to her. And keep in mind, after the Civil War, the reason cowboys and Indians became so important to people was because all the things they had romanticized together as Americans were no longer that romantic anymore. They had pushed the country almost to the brink of destruction. It's not surprising that the cowboy West became fascinating to Americans. When Billy the Kid was killed in 1881, it was front page news all over the country the next day. So you can't underestimate the importance of the West in the romance of the country and the importance of Fred Harvey in the romance of the West. The basic Fred Harvey story, if you've never heard it before, goes like this. In 1876, an Englishman in his early 40s took over the dining room on the 2nd floor of this building in Topeka, Kansas, with the idea that whichever train company took care of its passengers, that would be the one that survived. In these days, the railroads in the West had no dining cars, only restaurants, and every railroad had its own station. It would be as if the airlines each had their own airport. And railroads took care of their passengers about as well as airlines do today. The motto in the railroad business was "Freight doesn't complain." So the idea was that they took care of passengers because they had to, grudgingly, and that was the reason that the food on these Western railroad routes was so terrible. It was considered more dangerous to passengers than railroad crashes during that time. From 1876, in this one restaurant, the Fred Harvey system eventually became this. Now, keep in mind, this looks like a lot, but take it back in your mind to the turn of the century. Okay, the Fred Harvey system was the first chain of restaurants, national chain of restaurants, the first national chain of hotels, the first national chain of retail stores, the first national chain of anything in America. It extended the original route of the Santa Fe Railroad from Chicago all the way to Southern California. In the late 1890s, after the Depression, many railroads consolidated. The railroad then extended from St. Louis all the way down through Texas to the Gulf of Mexico and all over California, all the way up to San Francisco, where the Fred Harvey restaurants were on the ferries that went back and forth between Oakland, where the trains came in, and Maine, San Francisco. To give you some idea of the size of this company, I know you guys get your hands dirty in ordering. This is how much people were ordering for food orders for the Fred Harvey Company in 1908. It's a pretty stunning amount of food, and this is actually not the peak of the company. It's just the year that we have the most statistics for. The restaurants started as little trackside restaurants in small wooden depots. The idea of a Fred Harvey restaurant was to have a white tablecloth restaurant in the middle of nowhere that served fresh seafood, fresh meat, fresh vegetables, brought in on the train, a miracle for the time. Attached to something like this, a small lunchroom where you could order a la carte, and then take out coffee, like the first Starbucks. In reality, there was no fresh coffee in the West before Fred Harvey, and it was considered a miracle that you could get coffee that was actually made within 2 hours. This is one of the early dining rooms. In the late 1800s, the company expanded, the railroads expanded, people started coming to the West for tourism, and the company started building larger, mostly mission-style hotels all the way across the system. This is the first one in Las Vegas, New Mexico, before there was a Las Vegas, Nevada. It became immediately popular in America because Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders had their first reunion there, as it was like a corporate boondoggle on the part of the Santa Fe to get people to pay attention to their new hotels. So even back then, there were promotional things people did to get people to pay attention to new hotels. The company in 1905 opened at the Grand Canyon. Even though they had over 80 cities, the Grand Canyon immediately became their largest operation. And in fact, if you go to the Grand Canyon today, it is still run under the contracts that were made by the government and Fred Harvey at the turn of the century. Across from the main hotel there, El Tovar, is Hopi House, which originally was a place where Indians lived and made art. They demonstrated the art and people bought art. One of the businesses that Fred Harvey was in on the side was the Native American art business. The company later expanded into major city union stations, which were at that time the center of life in America. The first big union station was in St. Louis. They took over that, did all the food, all the retail. In 1914, they took over Kansas City Union Station, all the food, all the retail. It's where their corporate headquarters was. They had all kinds of retail businesses. This is a button from one of their toy stores. They had men's clothing stores, 24-hour bookstores, 24-hour pharmacies. It was a huge retail operation. This is Chicago Union Station. They went into the tourism business in a big way in the 1920s. The reason that people go to Santa Fe, go to the Grand Canyon, want to go experience America is because of advertising from the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company. And this is at its peak in 1929, just how big this is. I will have these slides available to you. You don't have to write them all down now. Just take it in. In 1929, at the peak of this company, the depot, they were in 80 different cities. They ran 60 dining cars. They served 12 million meals a year. They ran 25 hotels, 12 of them major resorts, 40 white tablecloth dining rooms, 54 lunchrooms. They had 7,000 employees, major tourism operations all through the Southwest, all the major union stations in the West, the one in Cleveland and the one in Los Angeles were about to open, and they had been in partnership with the first major airline. This is the last of the great major U.S. train stations, Union Station in Los Angeles, which they took over. This room is still there. It will become pretty soon one of the nicest restaurants in L.A., we believe. Fred Harvey's design guru was really into Native American stuff. This is a huge Native American rug made out of cut linoleum. It was put down in 1939. Still looks great. This is being used now as for movies. Last time I was there, they were shooting the Jonas Brothers video in it. But it will be a major restaurant in Los Angeles. The company got smaller during the Depression, then got bigger again during the Second World War when the federal government asked them to reopen all their locations around the Southwest to serve the troops. They became huge troop cafeterias for all the U.S. troops going to the Pacific. That's part of the reason why in 1946 MGM made a movie about Fred Harvey and the Harvey Girls called The Harvey Girls, starring Judy Garland at the peak of her career, which was a huge movie at the time. Any of you seen it? It's on Turner, one person, and she has that look on her eyes like, I saw that movie, yeah, okay. You should all watch it. It's on Turner Classic Movies all the time. Anyway, that's the basic outline of the company. What I'd like to do today, because you guys want to have your own careers in this field, and one of the great things about the Fred Harvey story, which wasn't known till I actually met the family and started digging into their stuff, was that you could actually get to know the people that ran this company. They left incredible number of personal materials. They left the materials that show how they built the business. They left the materials that showed how they passed the business on through generations. So this was a company that all over America, from the 1880s through the 1940s, people in business asked, how do these guys do it? What they do is so much better than what we do. How do they do this? And what's incredible is we actually can know that. So I'm going to take you through some of the materials that I have that I've recovered through this process. The rest of them are in the book. And for you to get to know sort of a great American entrepreneur in the field that you are interested in. So this is Fred Harvey, the earliest picture we have of him. He came to America from England in 1853. He got off the boat in New York City and got a job really right across the way from where the boats let out at a restaurant called Smith & McNell. Smith & McNell was a market restaurant in the Washington market in New York. And Smith & McNell didn't really trust each other. So every day at the end of business, they settled with all their purveyors, and then they split the profits between each other. So Fred Harvey learned from an early time to be somewhat distrustful of everybody, and that it was important for people who were fair in business to be people you wanted to do business with. These are some of the early photos of Fred. He was in New York for a number of years. He learned the restaurant business at Smith & McNell. And then he moved to St. Louis because he wanted to go west. I know that St. Louis to you is not the West, it's the Midwest. But in America in the 1850s, that's where the West ended. The West ended in Missouri. Everything else was just places you went with wagon trains. The trains didn't go past the border of Missouri. Fred Harvey went to Missouri. He opened his own restaurant. It was called the Merchant's Dining Room. If you'd like to see it today, it's not there, but if you stand directly under the arch, it's right in the middle of where that is. The Merchant's Dining Room was apparently a very successful restaurant, and Fred got married, he had a child, he had another on the way, and then the Civil War broke out. His partner was a Southern sympathizer, he took off with all their money, his restaurant went out of business. His wife gave birth to their second child and died in childbirth. So by his mid-20s, he had come to America, he had the American dream, and he had lost the American dream, and he started over. And he went through a period that you're probably not that interested in, which is that he was in the railroad business. But I'll tell you a little bit about it. He remarried to a woman named Sally Matas. They ended up living in Leavenworth. Leavenworth, this is beautiful downtown Leavenworth. You can see you'd really want to run there to start a business. This was to be the next great urban center of America, and Fred Harvey was there selling tickets and getting involved in the railroad business. He immediately, when he got there, the 2 children he had from his previous marriage died of scarlet fever within weeks. So there was a certain amount of tragedy that hung over Fred Harvey. It's actually part of the reason that he created an empire for people to feel good when they traveled. Because Fred was a guy who didn't always feel that great. And the idea that we have that when you get off a train, when you get off a plane, you're supposed to go to a place that makes you feel at home, Fred Harvey desperately wanted that in his life. This is Fred Harvey's wallet from Leavenworth, Kansas. His family had it in his stuff. This is his photo business card. If you think photo business cards are new, Fred Harvey had one in the 1860s. And we get to know Fred from his own date books. This is the earliest of his date books from 1867. I would love to tell you that they are full of deep psychological insights that allow a biographer to plumb the depths of the person's humanity. He was a businessman. Most of his date books are filled with lists of money that people owe him, lists of money he owes people. He was a lister. Most people who are smart entrepreneurs, I think, make lists of things that they're supposed to do, they want to do, and Fred was a big lister. We also have lots of letters that Fred wrote back to his family. Fred was always on the road. If you want to think about what it was like to travel in America when trains had no air conditioning, when most hotels didn't have electricity yet, and Fred was always on the road, so he really knew how hard it was to be on the road. And he basically was a railroad warrior selling freight for railroads for the next 2 decades. And when he reached his 40th birthday, he decided that he wanted something else. This is his wallet. He actually cut this story out of the newspaper, Maxims for Businessmen. You don't have to look at it. I made a PowerPoint of it because it's interesting, this thing that he cut out of the paper in 1875. Some of the advice is still really good for us today. Law is a trade in which lawyers eat the oysters and leave the clients the shells. Speak well of your friends, of your enemies say nothing. And at the very end, you can see the sort of the ethos of an American striver at this time. One of his heroes were the Rothschilds, and some of the advice that this gives is never have anything to do with an unlucky man, be cautious and bold, and make a bargain at once. And the bargain Fred Harvey made was that he wanted to go back into the restaurant business. By this time, the Western railroads were much more intact. They still didn't take care of their passengers at all. Fred first went to the railroad he worked for, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and said, let me take over your restaurants. If you have good restaurants, people will ride on your railroads. They would not give him that job. So he first made a deal with the Kansas Pacific, and these are some of his actual orders for the things they need in the restaurants for the Kansas Pacific, with a partner who he turned out he hated. So sometimes in business you have a really great idea and you have a partner and you hate his guts. In this case, this was an old friend of Fred's. They did not get along, and so they ran these restaurants on the Kansas Pacific, but Fred wanted another deal. He made a deal with the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad in late 1875, a handshake deal, which was that he would take over that lunchroom I showed you earlier. He would pay no rent, no utilities, would get free transportation for his foodstuffs and his employees on the railroad. The railroad passengers would have to have priority at all times. So when the train came through, whoever was eating in the restaurant had to stop eating so that the train passengers could be fed. And Fred kept all the profits. So that was his deal. And this is his list of stuff that he had to buy to turn this very dingy lunchroom into a white tablecloth restaurant, which he did. He bought fine silver. He bought all the things that you would find in a big hotel in New York or Chicago and brought it there. The restaurant was modestly successful. Fred still had his other job. Then he went to this town, which you can see is the kind of place you'd really want to invest your life savings in a new restaurant, in a boutique restaurant. This is Florence, Kansas. These are some of the fine gentlemen who live in Florence, Kansas. And Fred was given the opportunity to take over the restaurant and hotel there, which was a dump. But he had to buy it, so he had to spend all his money to do that. And he did something audacious. He hired the chef and general manager from the Palmer House Hotel, which at that time was probably the best known and best loved hotel in America, and asked him to come to the middle of nowhere and create the nation's first boutique restaurant and hotel. Told him he could do anything he wanted, he would pay him more than anybody else in town made, and the idea was to take this restaurant in the middle of nowhere and to bring international cuisine to the food of America. So they cooked the fish that were caught locally, the game that was shot locally, food that was brought in from Chicago on the trains. And we know about all this because the first reviews of this restaurant were in the newspapers in London. An American correspondent for a British newspaper was so blown away by the idea that you had this place that was both the highest standards of international cooking and this way to get involved with American regional cuisine sort of the first time. People from all over the place wanted to eat there. He hired him. This is actually, his name was William Phillips. This is Fred's contract with him. And they created something called the Clifton Hotel. And that was really the beginning of this idea of what the Fred Harvey system could be. Oases of restaurants and later hotels literally in the middle of nowhere. And the idea that you could do this because of the trains. As Fred went west, he also invested in the cattle business. Now, if you owned cattle then, you couldn't actually kill them and serve them in your restaurants because there was no place to have them slaughtered in the West. They were brought back and slaughtered in Chicago and in Kansas City, but Fred invested in the business as well. This is Fred in 1880 as his business starts taking off and he starts becoming prosperous. This is his wife, Sally. This is his oldest son, Ford, from his second marriage. Ford ended up being the heir to the company and in fact ran Fred Harvey for many more years than Fred Harvey did. And this is the oldest of his three daughters, Minnie, who also had some involvement. The Fred Harvey Santa Fe Railroad thing was immediately successful. Keep in mind that railroads were the big businesses of the day. Not a lot of people like big businesses. Fred Harvey humanized the big business of the Santa Fe Railroad. So they put his name on everything having to do with hospitality because he was the brand that made people feel taken care of in this big, faceless railroad. This is the oldest piece of Fred Harvey Santa Fe china that exists in this world. If you found it in your grandmother's stuff, you could sell it on eBay for enough you wouldn't have to finish this program. You could just retire on the money. If you have never been up on eBay looking at Fred Harvey stuff, it goes for a lot of money. The Harvey Company expanded. Besides all the trackside restaurants, they opened a huge health resort in Las Vegas, New Mexico called the Montezuma, which was at the time pretty much the biggest building in the West. It was not successful, and the Harvey Company decided to stick with trackside restaurants. They knew their business. So, in fact, he had the opportunity. He made a huge mistake. It luckily did not cost him that much money. But part of what's cool about the Harvey Company is that you can see in their growth that you even see them learning from their mistakes. A lot of businesses at that time, you had one mistake, that was it. Now, during this time, the Harvey Company invented something called the Harvey Girls. Now, even though you never heard of Fred Harvey, how many of you have heard of the Harvey Girls? Not the band, but the girls. No? Okay, the Harvey Girls were the first working women in America. In 1883, the Fred Harvey Company, which primarily in the West had African-American male employees serving people, found that there was so much racism in New Mexico because a lot of the cowboys were former Confederate soldiers. There were a lot of racial incidences in the restaurants in New Mexico. They decided that these African-American men needed to work away from the cowboys back in the kitchen and that they would start bringing women from the Midwest, single women, to work as waitresses. There were in these towns no single women who were not prostitutes before this time. They started this experiment in Las Vegas. It was successful. They decided to do it chain-wide. Now, the story is that this was because Fred Harvey wanted to set up a matrimonial agency, and in fact, many of these women ended up marrying and settling down. They signed contracts that said they had to stay single for 6 months, and if they did, they got a free ride anywhere they wanted on the Santa Fe Railroad. And then some of them stopped working for Fred Harvey, and some of them spent their whole careers there. But they filled up these towns with single women who otherwise would not have. But the real reason for creating the Harvey Girls is something that you would all appreciate being here, which was centralized hiring. This is the first time that somebody said, you know, we don't want to hire only the best people who are in these towns. A lot of these towns just got invented like 3 weeks ago by the railroad. We don't want just the best people here. We want people that we can train and that we can send out. So the Harvey system began recruiting single women in Kansas City, in Chicago, interviewing them. They had to send in their pictures. They had to be good-looking, single, young. They were hired, they were trained in the Eastern eating houses, and they were sent out to all these different locations. They lived in dormitories up next to the buildings, and they had a whole life in these cities. They were there to civilize these towns. On Friday nights, there were dances at the Fred Harvey establishments, the idea being that the cowboys in these towns should meet somebody and do something nice besides just going to saloons and meeting prostitutes. So the Harvey Company actually had a very high-minded idea of what hospitality could do in the West. And as you can see from these pictures, the Harvey girls had a lot of fun. It was an amazing experience. Generations and generations of women had this experience. From 1880s to the 1930s, 100,000 American women had the experience of being Harvey girls. They were the first female workforce. It was the first opportunity for women to work by themselves, to travel by themselves, and really see America. And we've been capturing lots of pictures of Harvey girls from all over the country. It's like a whole cult. And if you have relatives in the West, trust me, they know about this. Some of them from urban settings, some of them suburban. This is the only picture we have of a Harvey girl with a guy. They made sure that Harvey girls weren't photographed with guys because they never wanted anybody to think that Harvey girls were in any way of ill repute. They wore dresses that went from their neck all the way to the floor, like nuns almost. And it was an important cultural thing all over America. What people don't know that much about are the Harvey boys. The Fred Harvey system was America's first H&TM department. It was the first culinary school. This was a huge system that went through incredible numbers of chefs, incredible numbers of managers, and the best thing you could do when you were looking for a job was to be able to say that you worked for the Fred Harvey system because it was nationally known as the only system that was like this. And this was their goal. It's a little hard to read this cartoon, but this is a tourist coming to the Southwest, and she's saying, "Is this the wild and woolly West?" And he's saying, "Sure, shall we serve you quail on toast or lobster a la Newburgh for dinner?" The idea was you would go to a restaurant in the middle of nowhere, and they would have all kinds of fresh stuff that couldn't possibly be there. And that was the idea culinarily. Also, from a system standpoint, as the company got bigger, they wanted to have a Harvey way for everything so that all their employees knew what the Harvey rules were. Fred knew by telegram every morning how many eggs, how many cigars, this is all before phones, were consumed at every house of his the day before. There were rules for everything. The best known was the Harvey Girl Cup Code. When you ordered a drink, someone took your drink order and turned your coffee cup in the direction that told the pourer what you had ordered, so that they could very quickly do this because they had to serve full sit-down meals in 20 minutes. A train stop was 30 minutes. They had to serve what a normal white tablecloth restaurant might serve in an hour or longer in 20 minutes. They had standardized recipes, menus fixed so when the travelers were going along the train route, they wouldn't eat the same thing in each place. Back then, a chain didn't mean the same exact food at every place. The idea was the same quality in every place, but the knowledge that you were going to be on a long train ride, you didn't want to eat the same stuff every time. The chefs could be entrepreneurial, buy local produce, and send it along to other locations. By 1884, there were 12 eating houses. Fred Harvey was personally making $50,000 a year. In today's money, that's $1.1 million, being run by a small office in Kansas City. His company was run by this gentleman, David Benjamin, who had been his bank teller. Fred Harvey believed in hiring people he knew, who he trusted. He would rather train them than ask them to already know their business, and that's the way the Harvey Company always ran. They believed in training everybody and not in hiring executives or anybody else from outside. This is a list of Harvey fundamentals that was given out to employees all the way back into the 1880s. Here we have a PowerPoint of that. It's interesting, some of the issues that you think are pretty new in this business. Real services without discrimination. Discrimination issues, the Fred Harvey Company was operating in places where there were still Jim Crow laws. Preserve or create, never destroy. They had environmental issues and environmental message going back into the 1880s. Tact is an asset and honesty is still a virtue. The company that later expanded all the way to California, Ford Harvey, Fred's son, took it over. And Fred, even though he was the figurehead of this business, actually was not that involved because he was ill. Fred Harvey had what we would today think of as a combination of a depression and gastrointestinal issues. In this day, he was diagnosed with the quack diagnosis of the day, which was Americanitis. America was supposed to create this problem in Americans' nervous systems. It was a disease of the rich. Only wealthy people got it. And the way you treated it was to leave the country. So Fred Harvey went to England more than half of every year. He did his business by telegram. And he basically was waiting to feel better. So unfortunately, he did not get to benefit from a lot and enjoy a lot of what his company did. His company also had a huge falling out with the company that it started with. The Santa Fe Railroad changed ownership. They got into a fight with Fred. We actually learned a lot about the company because the lawsuit still exists. And so what we learned during this fight, which the Fred Harvey Company ultimately won, is in the late 1880s, early 1990s, they had 24 eating houses. They were serving 5,000 meals a day. They had 400 employees, a payroll of $250,000, about $6 million. And the situation was saved because the Depression came in 1893, and the railroad couldn't afford to fire them. Ford took over, and then we have what is Fred Harvey 2.0. The Fred Harvey system was remade for a new century starting in 1896. They made a new deal with the railroad where they split the profits. They added dining cars. The Fred Harvey Company took over all the retail for the Santa Fe Railroad. The railroad began building larger resort-style hotels. They started taking over Union stations. And Fred Harvey, who was still alive but never around, became a brand. This is the beginning of using one person's name as a brand. This had never been done before. It was only done because Fred Harvey was sick. And later because Fred Harvey was dead. They pretended for decades that Fred Harvey was still alive so they could say, your host is Fred Harvey. And this is something that people do all the time now, but this was not something that was done in America at this time. They actually took his signature and made it into the company logo. So they took over dining cars. Fred Harvey himself died in 1901. This is the last picture taken of him. When he died, he left a fascinating will that said that his company could not be changed for 10 years. His estate could not be probated for 10 years. So that the Fred Harvey legacy would live on long after him. And so a lot of things happened in the next 10 years when the company was still pretending that he was alive. The first train lines were built to the Grand Canyon, and the company built a hotel at the Grand Canyon. This is Ford and several Santa Fe executives discussing where the hotel should go at the lip of the Grand Canyon. They got into, because they were interested in Native American art and Native American culture, into the Native American art and craft business. This is Herman Schweitzer, who ran this whole business. And this is Mary Coulter. Mary Coulter was the first important American architect. She worked full-time for the Fred Harvey Company, designing the interiors and in some cases the exteriors of all these famous buildings that the Santa Fe Railroad built in the West. She also invented what we now call Santa Fe style. Santa Fe style was originally created for this room at the Indian Building at the Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque as a display room for all the Indian goods. People saw this and they were like, I want my house to look like this. And so people would come and want to buy everything that was there. It's the beginning of what, a lot of people now consider the style they want their houses to look like. This is Ford a little bit later in his life. And these are the maxims of the Fred Harvey Company that Ford believed his father had created and that he wanted to take forward. And they are really, I think, really good rules of business for today as well. Never buy a cheap thing. If you're in business with somebody and you have to buy stuff from them, if you save money at one point, you're going to wish you hadn't from your purveyors. The best price is always a fair price. Concentrate your business in as few hands as possible. Plow profits under. The Harvey Company always put their profits back in the company, and they were always ahead of businesses that had to report to stockholders. It was a private company, or where the family members were trying to take a lot of profits out of the business. Be committed to complete customer satisfaction. We had an interesting discussion at dinner last night about businesses that say they want to have better customer service. Better customer service. Well, what does that mean? At Fred Harvey, the idea was that sometimes the customer doesn't know what the thing is that they want. So just doing what they want is not actually customer satisfaction. Ford believed that you held constantly to a level of theoretical perfection that was actually more ambitious than what the customer asked you for. They believed in catching employees young, always promoting from within, gradual growth, and one of the Fred Harvey's lines was always please the cranks. The worst customers you had, the most annoying customers you had, he referred to as the cranks. And his belief is that anybody could take care of people that like you and like what you're doing, but it's the people who hate your guts who are the ones who are really going to make the difference in how you deal with them. And never take yourself too damn seriously. This is Freddie Harvey, Fred's grandson, a World War I flyer who wanted to take the business into a new modern direction when his generation took over. So this becomes Fred Harvey 3.0. After World War I and the railroads had been federalized, Ford and his son decided they were going to move beyond just railroads into taking care of all kinds of travelers. Route 66, the first major American highway, runs along the Santa Fe Railroad, so they are already taking care of the first drivers who are out checking out America. They make a major investment in Southwest tourism, and they partner with Transcontinental Air Transport. They set up something called Indian Detours in the Southwest, which thousands upon thousands of people came from all over the world to go in cars to Indian pueblos to see snake dances, to see real authentic American Indians. This was hugely successful, and they also got involved in this company. Transcontinental Air Transport was the first use of planes for travel. Planes didn't have lights then, airports didn't have lights then. To save time by a plane, you got on a train in New York, you took it to Columbus, Ohio, overnight. In the morning, you got on a plane. The plane flew to Waynoka, Oklahoma in the daytime, put down. You then ate dinner at the Fred Harvey restaurant in Waynoka. You took an overnight train to Clovis, New Mexico, where you got out and had a Fred Harvey breakfast. Then you flew on another plane to Winslow, Arizona, where you had a Fred Harvey dinner. And you took an overnight train to Los Angeles. That cut a full day out of transcontinental transit. And Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, Glenn Curtiss, all the American industrialists of the day were invested in this company. And Freddie Harvey was invested in it personally because he believed in the future of the airlines. This is where the Fred Harvey Company was poised when the stock market was about to crash, and then Ford Harvey died. Family businesses, you can look at economic trends, you can look at things that are happening in the country. Family businesses rise and fall because of family dynamics. Sometimes you just don't know the family dynamics. In the Harvey Company, the Harveys never knew these dynamics. I was dealing with them and telling them what happened to their company. What happened after Ford died is that his son and daughter, who owned all the stock in the company, got in a fight with his brother who wanted to run the company, who always felt that dad should have given him a better job in the company. And their aunt, Minnie, who we met earlier, was sort of in the middle. This picture gives you a pretty good idea of how the Harveys were getting along during this time period. And it was a really bad time for people to be in a fight because the Depression was really coming and it was not easy to know what to do. The railroads were contracting the number of places they had. The Super Chief, which was the famous railroad, the famous train that the Santa Fe started in the 1930s, was still a big deal. They created something called Membreno China for that train. If you know your family are China collectors, it's incredibly valuable. But Byron, the son, did win. The company was moved from its traditional home in Kansas City to Chicago, where it was never quite the same. It had a comeback during the Second World War, as I mentioned, which has caused the Harvey Girls movie to be made. This is another still from the Harvey Girls movie. This is Elizabeth Taylor holding Harvey Girls chocolates during the promotional campaign for the Harvey Girls movie. And the company contracted after the Second World War. The contracts at the Grand Canyon were incredibly valuable, and they are invaluable today. They had some Union Station businesses, they had some hotels in the Southwest, and opened non-Harvey Girl restaurants in Chicago and Los Angeles, which is sort of the beginning of the end for this incredible Americana kind of story that the Harvey Company represented. A lot of the buildings did not survive. There were huge preservation fights in the West to try to save some of the famous Fred Harvey buildings. This is the parking lot where the Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque was, one of the major preservation fights of the 20th century. But some of them did survive. This is La Posada in Winslow, Arizona, a town that until this hotel was made, no one went to Winslow except to stand on the corner of Winslow, Arizona, from the famous song by the Eagles. But a couple from California came, took over the hotel, bought it from the railroad, brought it back. It's now a 4-star hotel that gets regularly written up in Condé Nast Traveler and all the top magazines. It has a top restaurant whose chef was a finalist for the James Beard Award this year, all in the middle of nowhere. So if you want a model for a boutique operation, you have Fred Harvey's idea of a boutique operation in Florence, Kansas in 1880. And this place, totally modern, but the same idea, part of history travel, but also part of the most modern things you can do in this business. I'm going to stop and take questions in a second. I wanted to show you one more picture. This is my favorite Fred Harvey picture. I mean, the Fred Harvey Company was incredible numbers of people came to these places you cannot imagine. And of course, all the celebrities wanted to go to the Grand Canyon. This is a photo of Albert Einstein in 1930 coming to visit the Grand Canyon. When you came to the Grand Canyon, the Fred Harvey Company had many Indians who worked for them. Their job was to be Indians and to be in front of the buildings, to make art in front of the buildings. And when a celebrity came, they made him an honorary chief. Albert Einstein came to America in 1930 as Nazism was rising to give famous lectures at Caltech. During his lectures, he mentioned how even kids in Germany grow up playing cowboys and Indians, and they love this sort of stuff. So they took him to the Grand Canyon. When he arrived, the Indians went to their boss, Herman Schweitzer, up in the corner, and they said, well, who is this guy? And he said, well, he invented the theory of relativity. And they said, okay, we will name him the Great Relative. And the next day, a picture of Albert Einstein being named the Great Relative by the Hopi Indians was on the front page of every newspaper in the country, because that's how big a deal it was for a celebrity to go to the Grand Canyon at that time. I'm going to stop and take questions now, but if you're interested in any of this, we run a blog called One Nation Under Fred for people who are interested in Southwest travel. We also started, for people interested in the food business, a new food Tumblr called the Fred Harvey Cookbook, where every day we post an archival recipe from an actual Fred Harvey cook. We also post the cooking instructions from the cooks and some of the information that was given to servers. And you can also reach me if you're interested through my website at stephenfried.com. The Fred Harvey story is your story. It's the story of your business. And I hope you get a chance to read the book and learn more about this company. It is the beginning of what you want to do, and in many ways still gives you the best idea of what you should hope for in your businesses. Thank you very much. It's great to meet you. We have time for a few questions if anybody has one.
Absolutely. Ask questions, please. Ask questions.
Yes, go ahead.
How did you get interested in this, or how did you find out, decide to buy it?
Well, you know, I found out about it when I went to the Grand Canyon. It seemed like a great untold story, but when you meet an untold story, you can't know how deeply you should be jumping into it. Honestly, when I first got interested in it, I thought I would write a magazine article about it. And before the turn of the century, people weren't interested in Americana. Part of the reason Fred Harvey had lost favor is because that sort of old-fashioned Americana thing was not of interest. After 9/11, people started getting interested in American history stories again. And you started seeing books like Seabiscuit and Devil in the White City, books that were about a new way of writing about American history. And my editor asked me if I was going to write a book like that, what would it be? And by that time, I was really into Fred Harvey, really into the Southwest. But honestly, I knew almost nothing about him, because no one did. The fact that it was a multi-generational business had been well hidden, because that was their business model. So I was very fortunate when I came to the family and got all his stuff. It turned out there was a great business story there to be told, and a lot of the documents were still available. That was just complete luck. But you know, when you look back, I spent 6 years on and off on this book. There's no rhyme or reason to why you spend 6 years on anything. But I have to tell you, it was really fun. And it was an opportunity to also learn American history, because the company existed through so many periods of American history that I had had bad lectures about in college and in high school, that I kind of knew what the things were, but I didn't know what order they came in and what happened. So it was really a cool American history lesson, because these people were basically watching what we consider American history happening, and in many cases were involved in it. So it was an opportunity to recreate a business, and the opportunity to recreate a period in America that I knew nothing about, that we should all know more about. Yes?
How did Native American culture and like history and that kind of stuff affect the Fred Harvey restaurant and hotel chain?
That's very interesting. What she asked was how Native American culture affected the chain. Keep in mind that the Fred Harvey empire grew after the Long Walk, after all the things the federal government did to the Navajos and to the Hopis. So they were living in a culture that had really been decimated by previous things. The Fred Harvey Company and the Native Americans found themselves both trying to be in business together in the Southwest. And so the Harvey Company created a business for the Native Americans. They actually taught them how to make lighter, more tourist-friendly jewelry in order to have a subsistence economy. And at the same time, they curated what existed of Native American art and encouraged the artists. So they had a very interactive relationship. There has been some people who've had controversies about it because they see it as, you know, commercializing Native American culture. And there's no question that the Fred Harvey Company was involved in telling most people in America, it was probably the first time most people heard that the Native Americans were part of American history. So it's actually a fascinating side part of the business, the part that many of the Harvey family members are most passionate about, because they all collected Native American art. They grew up knowing the great Native American artists. But the issues of racism and discrimination and all these things are often asked because the Harvey Company was the only company that's actually in business with all these tribes for decades. And they ended up owning the best Native American art collection in the world, which was later donated to the Heard Museum in Phoenix. But if you go to any art museum and look at their Native American holdings, a high percentage of them will have originally been owned by the Fred Harvey Company. It was a huge side business which they thought was helped their restaurant and hotel business and made people interested in the Southwest and seeing an American culture through the eyes of Native American culture and Spanish culture, which is also part of the Southwest. Were you just yawning, or did you have a question? Putting on your coat, always dangerous at this point. Oh, anyway, thank you very much for your attention. It was great to meet you. If you have other questions or want to come up and talk to me afterwards, that's fine. And I will turn the podium back over to Richard.